Hello and welcome to the Currency Exchange, NatWest Markets weekly FX podcast, where we break down the major themes and events driving FX markets this week and in the weeks ahead. Today I'm joined by Brian Daingerfield, who is our US head of G10 FX. Brian, you were recently over our side of the pond, over in London, discussing the US election, which is now only 25 days away, with some of our UK-based investor clients. What were your kind of key takeaways from these meetings?
Yeah, Eimear, thanks very much for having me. So, the focus of our trip was really on the upcoming U.S. election and what it might mean for markets. And so we'll just start with what investors' expectations were for the election itself. We found broad-based uncertainty and really lack of conviction around the results of the presidential election. And we think that is certainly consistent with our own view, and it's consistent with polling as well that shows this race is extremely close relative to prior races that involved former President Trump. Trump is polling better in this race than he had in both 2016 and 2020. And similarly, polls at a national level and at the state level and in the House as well, and in a lot of Senate races. In a lot of cases, the most critical races that are going to decide control of not just the presidency, but the Congress are all suggesting this race is too close to call. And so what we observed in terms of who will win the presidency is a lot of uncertainty. And with that uncertainty came a generally low conviction in terms of how to position for that in FX markets, what to expect in terms of how to play the differentials. I think one of the things I took away from those discussions was perhaps a desire to maybe fade the market if it gets too far in one direction. So, for example, if we see betting odds or consensus seeming to drift towards Kamala Harris, maybe considering fading that because the polls are still quite close. And similarly on the Trump side, with most just seeing this as likely to be a very close contest. And so one of the takeaways there was a lack of certainty or a lack of understanding really of if there was a trade in foreign exchange markets that really makes sense in this current environment. As of course, we have a lot going on with the Fed and the U.S. macro cycle, the odds of, what's the next Fed meeting going to look like. There's a lot of other drivers, in the immediate term. But I got the sense that investors are still generally on the sidelines in terms of the U.S. election because there is so much uncertainty about the result at the top level.
And I guess it's a very hard environment for investors to put money to work when there's such a big market event and so much uncertainty around it. Very curious, what is, when it comes to FX, how are you viewing the dollar into this election? What do you think, is the dollar's reaction on Trump versus Harris?
So, our broad outlook is for the dollar to strengthen in the event that Trump wins the election, and for it to weaken if Harris wins the election. And really, we're spending a lot of our time thinking about Trump and the reaction to a Trump victory. Because when we look down the Senate and the House, we are expecting that if Harris wins, she's more likely to win with divided government because of the very difficult outlook for Democrats in the Senate. It would take probably a wave election for Democrats in order for them to win with a Senate majority in our view, which means it's more likely that if we get a Harris victory, it comes in a very similar shape to the current government, a Democratic president with a divided Congress, with at least one of the chambers of Congress being held by Republicans. And so if we end up with a Harris victory, we think it's more likely to be one of more of the same from a policy perspective. So what that means is I think markets will be reacting to either pricing in or pricing out of Trump victory scenarios. And so what are those victory scenarios and what do we think it means? First, we think Trump is more likely to win with a majority if he wins because the Republican Party does have an embedded advantage in the Senate thanks to the calendar this year. And we think the House is likely to go with the president. The House majority tends to correlate pretty well with the national mood and the national popular vote. Does tend to be a pretty good indicator of House control. And so we think that the president's party, the winning president, is likely their party's probably going to eke out control of the House, albeit probably closely divided in either way. So we think Trump more likely to win with united government. And so what are we thinking about in terms of what could drive the dollar? Among the factors we think could strengthen the dollar include markets assuming higher expectations of new fiscal stimulus, whether that be from tax cuts, both extending expiring provisions of previous tax cuts under the Trump tax law in 2017, and also potentially new cuts to taxes, including for businesses and for individuals. Trump has been a little bit cagey in terms of the details of what specifically he would actually try and get over the finish line. But we do think that markets would have to account for potential risk of significantly higher fiscal stimulus, and that might mean higher interest rates in the U.S. and with it, a stronger dollar tends to correlate with that expectation. At the same time, we're thinking about the possibility of significantly higher tariffs. Now, I think it's right to wonder or to believe that a significant increase in tariffs, if Trump were to follow through with the plans on, say, global minimum tariff, increase in tariffs on China, for example, that he's been pledging, that's something that should weigh on growth expectations, we think. It's something that's not a pure positive, certainly for the US. But when it comes to growth differentials, which matter for the dollar and for foreign exchange, a big push on tariffs is something that likely hurts manufacturing-linked economies and export-linked economies more than it would hurt economies that we think are, that are more services-oriented and consumer-oriented, internally oriented. So in the latter case, we're talking about the U.S. services, internal, consumer-oriented, whereas growth expectations in larger, more export-sensitive, manufacturing-sensitive economies, think China and a lot of the economies in Europe, certainly the ones you cover, Eimear, may be more exposed in terms of how growth expectations shift lower. And so from a relative growth expectations, that could push in favor of the dollar as well if markets are pricing in a weaker global growth outlook and specifically weaker growth outlook in some of the world's more manufacturing and external linked economies. So we do think that the Trump scenario likely pushes in the direction of a stronger dollar. And for Harris, we think a weaker dollar, not necessarily because her policies point towards a weaker dollar, but because we think the market will be pricing away from those Trump alternatives. And if the Trump scenario is, call it a 50% probability on election day, and that's the stronger dollar outcome, then if you end up eliminating that outcome, that might mean we get a weaker dollar simply from eliminating that potential Trump victory outcome. And so that's how we're shaping up. That's how we're seeing the dollar shape up in the aftermath of the U.S. election, how we're thinking about policy and how the dollar will respond to that. And that was the message we've been talking about with investors over the last couple of weeks as regards foreign exchange.
I guess the question is that how investors see it? Is there kind of consensus over the dollar views?
So I think that the consensus broadly aligns with what we're thinking here, although there is certainly some differentiation. And the differentiation we've noticed in our discussions largely comes down to the fact that we know that Trump doesn't want a stronger dollar, that Trump wants to push policies that we think are consistent with a stronger dollar, but that he himself has been critical of the strong dollar and the strong dollar's role in adjusting trade, adjusting trade imbalances. Trump is very focused on numerical dollar-based trade deficits with offending nations in this case, and wanting to correct those. One of the ways that, in theory, one of the tools to correct those imbalances could be a weaker currency. A weaker currency would make U.S. exports more competitive and potentially act to maybe change some of those persistent trade deficits. One of the potential tools. We also know that Trump has, he's called for lower interest rates. He generally wants lower interest rates and a weaker dollar. He's been critical of the Federal Reserve in the past and would likely be so if he were to win the presidency. And so that ends up being the biggest source of potential concern, which is perhaps I would say, a loose agreement in terms of the policies probably push towards stronger dollar on Trump, but certainly some, perhaps a large grain of salt that comes from the potential desire of the president to maybe alter the FX reaction that would be appropriate normally under the result of his policies. And so that's probably the biggest specific point of maybe uncertainty. But I'll just say broadly, Eimear, that there really is not a big consensus trade. There is not, I would say, a specific Trump victory proxy in the market. Certainly when thinking about some of the EM currencies in your world, that often get cited as potential currencies that could come under some pressure. If you were to get Trump victory, think about geopolitics and trade, right? Is Trump going to, increase uncertainty around China as relates to a re-escalation or a reintroduction of what we call active trade war risk? What about the situation in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe, and how does that impact How does a change in the situation there impact manufacturing in the region and also the security situation, right? So there are a couple of emerging market currencies, especially that I think markets are generally looking at as these are potential currencies that could be vulnerable against the dollar if Trump were to win. But again, I think that the certainly from our conversations with investors, a lot of this is light expectations, light positioning, and a general lack of consensus. And I think part of that just reflects the fact that this race is so unbelievably close. And I don't think investors have a ton of confidence in who will be the winner of the November 5th election. And so, plenty of ideas around what the direction of FX markets will go, but I would say not a lot of conviction and not a lot of active positioning in markets specifically around this critical event.
Yeah, I think you're extremely right when you talk about EM. I think a lot of investors are looking to that 2016 playbook where, is this negative for the Mexican peso or for the Chinese yuan? But obviously, this is an extremely different environment. I think for me, the one thing I keep saying is that kind of the clearest impact of a Trump presidency is what it means for geopolitics, especially around Ukraine and, the implicit kind of security risk that maybe pertains to a country like Poland, which is kind of the next NATO member on Ukraine's border. But it's not in the EM space. There's no clear consensus, which really kind of underlines that kind of this massive, event in markets and really no clear outlook around it. Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining me today. And that's probably all we have time for. But if you did like the podcast, please do click like and remember to subscribe so you get the latest episode first. Thanks again.